Okei, tervetuloa hyvä yleisö tähän keskustelutilaisuuteen pohjoismaisesta sosialismista. Ja keskustelu käydään englanniksi, joten itsekin vaihdan englantiin tämän siljän tien. So, welcome everybody to this discussion event on Nordic socialism. And the discussion is based on the book Nordic Socialism, which is now translated into Finnish, titled as Pohjoismainen sosialismi kohti demokraattista taloutta. And we have here Taija Roija, who will interview Pelle Dragstedt, who's the author and writer of the book. And Taija Roija is the chief editor of Nuori Voima cultural magazine. And Pelle Dragstedt is a spokesperson for Enhedslisten, Danish left-wing party, and as said, author of this book Nordic Socialism, which is now translated from Danish to Finnish. And my name is Jukka Peltokoski. I work in KSL Study Center, and I'm connected to this book the way that KSL Study Center has supported the translation of the book. And made the initiative to translate the book. But book is published by Vastapaino, and there are books available to purchase here. And also there's available some wine and juice to be freely socialized. So please welcome and have some wine and juice too. But I give now the speech to Taija and Pelle, and they will continue the discussion. And audience can also participate in the discussion. But when you participate, then I will give you this mic, and it is important to speak to the microphone because we have also online streaming, and the voice goes to the stream only via this microphone. So use microphone if you like to have some words. So, okay, but please welcome everybody, and nice to have you here. And most of all, of course, Taija and Pelle.
Thank you, Jukka, for your introduction, and also on my behalf, warmly welcome Pelle here on stage. Nice to have you here. So for the next around 45 minutes or so, we will discuss Pelle Dragstedt's ideas based on his, not new book anymore. It has been out in Danish for 3 years or so, but now a new book in Finnish. So your book, Pohjoismainen sosialismi, which has been translated into Finnish by Krister Lindholm. So we will talk here, and then the audience, you have the possibility to participate in the Q&A section. And of course, if at some point you feel that you absolutely want to add something or add for some clarification or something, so please just raise your hand and we will give you the mic. But let's start. So first of all, I have to say that it's not a small task to write this kind of general presentation about the history, current state and future of the so-called Nordic model or the Nordic socialist model. But this difficult task is more or less what you, Pelle, are doing in your book, Nordic Socialism, which has now been translated into Finnish, as we just mentioned. To sum up some starting points for this discussion, I would say that the aim of your book is to show that there are alternatives to capitalism, and that the sprouts of these alternatives, they are already quite visible in our society and also have been there for quite some time. So today we will have the chance to discuss about these ideas and how they are part of our current society. But first I must start by asking you, because I was quite impressed by this endeavor, because you have been a member of the parliament and participated in such many activities. What made you want to write this book in the first place? How did you do it?
Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a pleasure being present, and thank you to all of you for coming. It's really nice for me to be able also to discuss the book with the Finnish public. So, I think I wrote the book out of a kind of sense of urgency in some way, that I have been a left-wing activist all my life. I've been in parliament, and I always felt that in some way something was missing, that there was kind of an abyss between, our daily political work, like in movements and unions and parliaments, and then this vision for socialism or for a kind of post-capitalist economy and society, that it was quite separated and not... so socialism was something in the future, some kind of distant fairy tale or a utopia, and then we just kind of defended a little bit the welfare state today or fought for workers' rights and so on. So what I try with this book is to bridge this abyss and show that our daily efforts and the result that the workers' movement and left-wing parties has achieved during the last 150 years, and also parts of the more liberal cooperative movement actually, are in fact has a lot to do with socialism, because I'll come back to that. So what I try with this book is to restart a debate about socialism, but taking a different start, you could say, acknowledging that socialism is not some distant utopia, but it's something that, as you said, present in our actual economies, not least in the Nordic countries, but in fact in many capitalist-dominated economies. So that kind of my starting point, to say that socialism is not something that we have to start from scratch. It's an experience that we have, that we know, that we from our daily lives. So, yeah, and I don't know if I should go further into it, or if we...
Well, I could add something and maybe ask something like at this point. So I was thinking about the concept of capitalism, because of course it's very difficult. Oh, yeah, for leftists it's usually used as even a critique, that for leftist thinkers you always need to have something to critique, and then of course capitalism is something that you can take as your starting point, something that you can make your criticism about. But as an economic and political and cultural system, capitalism has indeed become a powerful and so powerful that people often feel that it's very difficult to imagine a world without capitalism. And it's very famous catchphrase that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, which has been originated from Frederick Jameson and then onward to Zizek and Fisher and so on. But as you mentioned that you see that we don't have to, when we start to build a different kind of society, we don't have to start from the scratch. Could you elaborate more on this idea? So how can we imagine the future beyond capitalism? What are the sprouts that we could more focus on?
Well, I think the diagnosis that you're doing is quite right. I think not least in the last 20 years, I think a lot of people acknowledge that the capitalist economy as it exists is kind of not really functioning. It is a threat to our planetary boundaries. It's creating an ever-increasing inequality in income, but also in power and influence. So that is kind of the easy part. The critique part, of course, it's part of my book, but I think it's not kind of the most controversial. The problem is that people have difficulties imagining alternatives. And of course, they point to the socialist experiences of the Eastern Europe and Soviet Union, and that maybe even make it more difficult to talk about socialism as a viable alternative. And what I'm trying to discuss in my book is that maybe the way that we on the left and broader in society have understood and talked about capitalism is part of the reason for making it so difficult to imagine how to change it. Because the way that we talk about capitalism normally on the left is kind of a all-encompassing system, like a totality. So we, for example, in our daily speak, we say, "Oh, I live in a capitalist country," or "I live in a capitalist economy. We have a capitalist market." Some Marxists would even say we have a capitalist state. So, and the question I pose in the book is this really a good way to describe the existing society, not least the Nordic economies? Because the first question then we should pose is, what is capitalism? If it's not everything, what is it? And if you take a lexical point of view, capitalism is a way to organize production in which capital owners own the production apparatus, the means of production, as Marxist says, and they are kind of producing for profits and selling their goods or services in a marketplace. So if this is a definition of capitalism, and we look at our existing economies today, and maybe even more 30 or 40 years ago in the Nordic, it's quite obvious that an important part of the economy doesn't fit that description. We have a public sector, hospitals, kindergartens, universities, schools, all kind of public institutions, and they are in fact production facilities. They are means of production. A hospital, for example, in the United States is it's a company. You employ people, you sell goods or services. So in the Nordic countries, a lot of this area kind of production is organized and owned by us through elected politicians, of course. The services they produced are not sold at a market, but is kind of distributed through a solidaristic tax system. For example, in Denmark, every third worker in the workforce works in this sector. So it's quite a big sector. Around 25% of GDP is created in this sector. And it's not only the public sector, it's actually we are also in the Nordics have a history for private, democratically owned companies in what we call cooperatives. In Danish we call it andelsselskaber. It's a little bit the same Finnish words, I think. And of course, these companies are owned by consumers or small producers, in some cases by workers, and they're organized democratically. And that means that the leadership of these enterprises are answering to broad groups instead of just capital owners. So these sectors, normally we would just say they're part of capitalism, but what I'm trying to do is to say that we should maybe look at these sectors as a other way of organizing production that is more close to socialist ideas than to what would be the meaning of capitalism. So that's one important feature of what I call how I think we should kind of look to capitalism in a different way. The other one is decommodification. That is a really intellectual word, but it means changing something that were commodities that we bought and sold in a market into social rights. So in the Nordic countries, for example, education, healthcare, to a certain degree, other kinds of care, is decommodified. So they were made from things that we had to acquire through our purchasing power in a market into social rights that we as citizens can access. And of course, this is really important because it makes people living in this country less dependent on market and the power that market exerts over individuals. So my idea in the book is to, instead of looking at our economies as just capitalist, acknowledging that actually it's a kind of hybrid, that we have different ways of organizing production inside our economy that compete with each other and is in constant rivalry. If you look at kind of historically, from about 1870s and then 100 years in advance, we had this enormous expansion of common democratic ownership. Firstly, through the cooperative movement. In Denmark, for example, all agriculture was dominated by cooperatives. In few years, they totally excluded capitalist relations inside the agricultural sector. And And then came the welfare state, the public ownership, the decommodification. So for 100 years we saw this expansion of what I call socialist modes of productions in our economy. Then, of course, the last 40 years we have seen maybe the opposite development, where an expansion of a non-democratic or capitalist ownership has evolved through privatization of public entities, demutualization of cooperatives, introducing different kind of market ways of organizing production, etc. So, but that should show us, even though all my life has been in this neoliberal era, at least my adult life, it shows that this is not static, that these two sectors are kind of competing, and it's kind of organizing and politics that can change the direction of and the balances of forces, you could say, between these different modes of production. So instead of viewing an economy as either capitalist or socialist, my proposal is to view it as more or less capitalist or socialist. And I think this way of understanding it gives us not only a better analysis to, for example, explain the differences between Norway and United States, two capitalist countries but with great differences, or the difference between different periods, like, you know, there's a big difference between the Nordic countries in the 70s and today. But I think even more importantly, it gives us the ability to make socialism something known, and I would even say something loved, because public libraries, access to healthcare, free education. I think it's something that the broad majority of our citizens is enjoying and finding a really important part of. And just describing this as capitalism, or kind of repressive tolerance, or the reproductive sphere of capitalism, all this kind of words that the left has put on these relations, kind of hide the facts that this was brought to us by struggle, by people who fought for socialist ideas, and in fact, in several ways, changed the relation of forces of our society and changed the lives of normal people. For example, making us far less dependent on markets. So, I think accepting that we should not start from scratch, but that we have these building blocks for creating a more socialist society, makes it far easier to argue and to imagine for you could say starting this journey, or not starting it, but continuing this journey towards a more socialist society. And of course, that would socialism or socialist organization is not the goal in itself. Of course, it's just tools in order to achieve more freer and lives with more freedom and security, empowering democracy in order to also be able to solve some of the fundamental problems that we are facing right now in climate change and biodiversity crisis, etc. So yeah, that's kind of the main idea of the book.
One of the things I really enjoyed in your book is the way it kind of rejects these easy statements, and it rejects binaries as well. So you really like work against these totalities that you should choose from this or this approach, but you actually try to bring these different approaches together. And this reminded me of issue that you also handle in your book about the very traditional divisions between the leftist political movement. So usually we have this idea that there is either the reformist or the revolutionary school within the leftist political movement, and often these different kinds of schools are kind of like against each other, and if someone happens to be too reformistic, then it's kind of like you don't have to listen to those analysis, and if some other is too like revolutionizing, like having this idea, so you don't have to listen to that and da da da. So you kind of take a position that surpasses this binary and kind of make a combination of these both. And you call this, at least at some point in your book, radical reformism. Is that correct? So could you tell us more about this approach of how do you combine these two different kinds of schools of reformism and revolutionary thought?
Yeah, I think for many years I've thought that this division between reformism and revolution is kind of the wrong division line, because, you know, even if you're revolutionary and you kind of think about kind of taking state power, the thing that you will have to do afterwards is reforms, of course, because for me it has always been a little bit strange that it was kind of what should be the main division should be kind of the what do you call it, the time frame of these changes. For me, the important division between what I would call modern social democracy and the position that I represent would be the willingness to go beyond capitalist relation and to challenge the ownership model of that exists now as a dominating principle with this really concentrated and non-democratic ownership to our production apparatus, and in its broadest sense, corporation, banks, land, data, patents, different assets, housing. So I think that should be the main division. If you kind of accept that economy in which a tiny minority is kind of the dominating owner of our production is kind of the end of history, or you, like me, thinks that we can go beyond that way of organizing our economy and moves toward a more socialist economy, or I would rather say an economy with a socialist relation, that is to say democratic governance of companies and decommodification of important part of our economy would be the dominating principle. So I'm really trying to, as you say, challenge this kind of binaries, for example. And one important thing of that, when we don't talk about capitalism as a totality, we don't need to talk or understand socialism as a totality. So one failure I think the socialist movement has done throughout the years has been to try to do this modeling. How do the perfect socialist society look? What kind of ownership models? And it was typically this kind of very uniform models, like the state as a sole owner. For example, if you abolish private property, like have been the program of most, even social democratic parties early on. Of course, if you don't have any private property rights, then the state is the sole owner, of course, because you can't defend any other ownership, not even cooperative ownership. So, okay, it was a detour. But my idea here is that I think we should imagine socialism as a much more pluralist way of organizing production, where, of course, democratic forms of ownership and production would be the dominating ones, but actually there would be no problems in small businesses or entrepreneurs. I think actually it's quite important that these would also be a part of the a production. So actually in the capitalism that we know today, it's not so much this kind of creative capitalism of people actually creating companies. The dominating principle of capitalism today is passive ownership. It's kind of rentier capitalism more than this creative process that we hear about when, you know, liberals are talking about capitalism. So, so I'm challenging this binaries also concerning, for example, the binary of market or planning, but maybe we can get back to that later on.
Well, you can continue, like about the market, that you give quite a emphasis on the market, and you're not like you don't consider it as a threat, I might say. You consider market as a very normal and vital part of our society. Could you elaborate on that, how you see the role of the market?
Yeah, I would say when I started to read the book, I really hoped that I could convince myself that we could organize production without market forces. But I think the experiences from trying to organize production only in a planned way without using market forces is quite clear. It does not function in a complex modern society with a high diversification in production. In the Soviet Union, and now we look apart from the terrible authoritarian murderous effects of this regime and only focus on the economics. It did function actually in the 50s and the 60s because it was a really primitive production, you know, producing steel or this kind of, could be organized by planning. But when the economy diversified, when, you know, people during maybe the Khrushchev era got access to consumer goods. I can give this example. The first gas plant in the Soviet Union, you know, planning for the production until the last element in the factory, it had to organize about 800 products. The last gas plant was made in the 80s. Should organize, I think it was 1,200,000 products. So of course this diversification of production made it so difficult to do this through planning. So therefore, my point of view is that the idea of a totally planned economy is not attractive. That's my clear conclusion from reading a lot about this. But then, of course, the critique of the market from for example, Marx and Engels as a kind of anarchistic, crisis-prone, this critique is right. You know, market organization creates inequalities. It creates recurring crises. It makes the profit motive the central motive of production, etc. So, what my conclusion, of course, it's just a preliminary conclusion, like every book on socialism should be, is that we have to find some kind of middle way. So that's why I'm challenging this idea of a binary, because in reality, we talk about you know, a market economy and planned economy as two separate systems, but in reality, we don't have ever seen in the world a kind of pure market economy. As Karl Polanyi wrote famously many years ago, I don't remember exactly when his book came, that would not be possible. He talks about it would make life so bad for people that there would be a social reaction, and then market relation would be driven away from parts of the social relations. On the other hand, and that's what we have seen in our countries. You know, if you look at Finnish society, a great part of the economy is planned. Like your public sector is a planned economy. Some organization, our energy infrastructure, at least in Denmark, is obviously a planned economy. And then we're using all kind of like industrial policy, counter-cyclical finance policy. All these kinds of interference is also kind of different kinds of planning. So in reality, it's not a question about choosing a total market economy or a planned economy. The question is where on this spectrum is the best place to be in order to use the informational power of market relations without having the bad consequences of market anarchism, you could say. And I have some discussions on that. And so what I think is that today we are obviously on a spectrum too close to total market economy, and we should move in the direction of much more democratic planning. And I use as an example in my book the climate law in Denmark. We made with the last government, my party was kind of not part of government, but part of the coalition. And we succeeded in making this climate law who says we have to lower the carbon emission by 70% before 2030, and it was made kind of a law, meaning that even though the government changes, they have to fulfill it, and if they don't fulfill it, they will have to go to the parliament, and there's even a council, an independent council, kind of doing surveillance if they are fulfilling this law. So for me, that is a small example of what planning could be, okay? So that we decide some clear outcomes or goals of our economy, and then we start sector by sector to organize them in order to achieve these goals. So that's a new way to think about economics, at least now. If we go back to the 60s or the 70s, industrial policy was kind of the same. The Nordic models of full employment was kind of the same, but for the last decades, of course, there has only been one goal, and that was growth in GDP. So that would be another way of planning. And then, of course, decommodifying new parts of our economy. Like, for example, in Finland, and I'm told that dental care is part of the public healthcare system. It's not in Denmark. It's a great problem, not least for pensioners and others with few resources, that they can't go to dental care because it's too expensive. So that would be obviously a step. I heard from Lee Anderson from the Left Alliance that here in the last government, they succeeded in doing hobbies for kids, like sport and so on, as a decommodified, making access free. Another good example of how to expand the non-market relation area of the economy: public transport, Wi-Fi, housing, and all these kind of issues could be discussed.
I think currently one of the main problems is, though, that even though we have these systems of free dental care, or well, that is a good example, but we have these structures, but they are kind of they don't have enough like money to actually so that they could work properly, and then there are like people have to queue for a very long time to get the care that they need. So there are cases that these ideas work more on theory than in practice. So do you see, is this relevant for Denmark as well?
Yeah, of course, and also, for example, also in the cooperative sector, we have big cooperatives in Denmark, in the energy sector, for example, or in the banking sector, where democracy is more formal than real. So of course, this is not something static. We will have all the time to fight for, deepening democracy, or, for example, in this case, deepening the functioning of this decommodification. And this, starve the beast strategy has been an integral part of neoliberal governments to, starve the public sector in order to make private alternatives more attractive. So, for example, in Denmark, more and more people are getting a private health insurance. Even though we have a public healthcare system, then they can jump the queue. So, of course, we should fight very hard against this kind of maneuvers to undermine the decommodification of our basic needs.
I have a lot of questions for you, but we are, not running out of time yet, but I would maybe say to the audience that now would be a good time to maybe think about if you have any questions, and you can formulate them in your own heads, and I will come to you in a bit to ask if you have anything to add to this discussion. But as we mentioned and discussed just now, a big part of your book handles the question of public ownership, and quite often this brings into mind the questions of like land and infrastructure, like such as distribution of water and electricity, and these very concrete material things. But in addition to these very fundamental services, many intangible goods, such as information, knowledge, and data, are becoming more and more significant factors in our society, and of course they already are. But how do you see that? How does this idea of public ownership that you already discussed applies to these kinds of issues, and how can we democratize information in the era of these giant multinational techno corporations like Apple and Amazon and Google, for instance?
Yeah. Well, actually, I think that this kind of intangible goods should be easier to kind of socialize than the tangible goods, because I don't know if you know this Marxist concept of enclosure. When the land was, they put fences to the land and changed common land into profitable private land, you could say. So it's much more difficult to enclose this intangible assets, of course. So they need to create all this kind of intellectual property law that is quite difficult to uphold, as we know. So I think actually, and also because a lot of this is not really capital heavy, so it's easier to make cooperative alternatives. Let me give an example. Finland has produced many good things, but we have a little problem with Volt in Denmark. It's the main courier in Copenhagen, and they really are fighting against union organizing and doing this kind of union busting, and they're trying to fight against giving their workers the right that they deserve. So, but for example, creating an alternative courier system, of course, there's this network problem. That is one of the problems about this, but it's not capital heavy. It's just a code. Okay, it's just software, and I really think that it should be possible for the couriers together with the restaurants, because they are also getting fucked up by Volt, to organize a cooperative to do this delivery of food, because for every part of the consumer, those who produce the food and those who bring the food, that would be a great idea. So I think that because it's not capital heavy, it should be easier. And actually, I give some examples in the book. There have been good examples. For example, in Ontario. One Canadian city, I don't remember exactly what, they created an alternative to Uber, that is owned by the drivers and the consumers. So it's kind of a mixed cooperative. And they're exporting this software to Dakar, for example, where they have done it same. And the same with this, in Europe, they have done a common for cycle couriers, not for food, but other kind of goods. And they kind of export this software to each other, to cooperative throughout Europe. So that's, I think it's not an obstacle, but one obstacle, of course, is that these companies are global. So how do we create democratic ownership on an international level? It's difficult, but actually in Twitter, for example, in 2015, a group of stock owners went to the General Assembly of Twitter and proposed that it should be converted into a co-op owned by the Twitter users, and that they should take it over gradually by being paid for the advertisement that they created. Of course, it was not voted through, but in a way, it showed a way in order to socialize this kind of services. And actually, I think it's quite important, because the discussion about who should own Twitter, obviously it's not good that it's Musk. And then you could say, oh, the state should take over, but are we sure that we want Donald Trump or Erdogan or the China's president or other to be owners of social media? No, I don't think so. So actually, I think cooperative ownership, not only for economic reasons, but also for political reasons, would be the best way to organize this kind of services. And then we have, this can be done from upside. But for example, it's maybe an example that have been overused, but Wikipedia is an example of creating decommodification from below. You know, who buys Oxford lexicon today because we have a much more dynamic, So, but it's difficult, of course.
So it sounds like you need to start this series. That this your book now that has been translated is the first part is the Nordic socialism, and then is the European, and then is the international. So you can kind of like tackle all these questions on the level that they need to be handled. How about in the audience? Do you have any comments, questions at this point? Or, we will need the microphone. Thank you.
Hello. I hope I'm not like busting everybody's eardrums here. Do you have any opinion about modern monetary theory?
Yes, I see modern monetary theory as kind of, some have called it Keynesianism on speed, and I think that in some ways a proper way of describing it. I think I agree that depth, and that should be important in the Finnish debate, is not kind of a boundary in an economy, at least an economy with its own currency. There you have a problem, but on a European level. I think it carries important insights, but of course it was very popular in the time where there was no inflation, and even countries with, So the critique right now goes that maybe there's not a kind of a depth boundary, but of course there's an inflationary boundary. You cannot just print money without creating, in some instance, an inflationary effect. And I think also from a Marxist economist point of view, it's, money is just kind of reflection of a real economy or real production. So, for example, this positive money movement, I have a lot of good conversation with them also in Denmark. I think it's really inspiring that they have been able to create a kind of a movement around such a fuzzy thing as money production. But I think also that they are a little bit too focused on money and not on the way, for example, they are very focused on how much money are created. But in fact, the important thing in an economy is how is money circulating, and not just the amount of money. Because if these are just numbers on a bank account, it doesn't have the same interference as if they're circulating. And that's a more Keynesian way of looking at it. But it's a big discussions. But I think as a part of this heterogeneous economic discussions that have come forward in the last year, I think they have done really important contributions also. So it's inspiring.
Here's another question from the audience.
Well, thank you for your introduction. It has been a pleasure to listen to you. My question is about Thomas Piketty. I think, I've tried to read his very, very thick books. I have the impression that more or less he is on the same lines with you, as far as accepting all kinds of institutions, welfare state institutions, and sort of cooperative institutions, etc., etc. But I got the impression that Thomas Piketty, when he is thinking about the main sort of strategy of socialism, is relying on taxation. What is your your opinion. As I understand, he sees very many sort of uses for taxation, not only sort of narrowing the income differences, but also financing the welfare state, and etc., etc. But I got the impression that really the narrowing of the incomes differences is, in his eyes, perhaps the main reason for thinking that taxation is important.
Yeah, first of all, I think Thomas Piketty has been a real important voice in the economic debate and has really changed kind of the gameplay in some ways. It made it much more easy to talk about taxing. And I really also love that he uses the word socialism. I think he talked about participatory socialism, as I remember. And in some way, it could... I love that as much as using the term Nordic socialism. It's not so important what we call it. The important thing is that we think about the socialist ideals, about democratizing the economy. So it's true that at least in his first books, he was very focused on taxation. And of course, taxation is important. It has been a really great way to reduce inequality, not least in the Nordic countries. We have a lot of experience in doing this. And I really think that it still should be an important part of socialist politics. But taxation, as someone has said, is kind of coming a little bit late to the party because you use tax for redistribution because, you know, there was a wrong distribution in the first place in the production process between wages and profits, between different officers. So what I focuses on in the book is what you could call pre-distribution, or trying to make taxation less necessary because we secure that in the first place, when the production happens and the values are created, that the distribution of this income and wealth is democratized. So you could say, if we succeeded in kind of having an economy dominated by socialist production relation, cooperatives, foundations, I think there would be much less need for taxation because redistribution would have happened already in the first. But of course we would need it because, you know, when people are retired, for example, then maybe they're not having wages, or still there would be different wages, maybe more productive places in the economy and so on. So tax would be necessary. But the problem with taxing is that you don't really change the power relationship. And that's kind of my main critique of social democracy, or at least modern social democracy, but also that is that I think the experiences of Nordic social democracy is a history of success and of failure, because you can't deny that it was a great success. You know, you lifted thousands and thousands of workers out of poverty, but also, you know, out of a totally underprivileged position without any influence and so on. So it was a great success. And in Finland, your history is a little bit different because the left party also was part of this reformist project from the where the left in Denmark was a little bit more outside, but then also a history of failure, because the problem was that you didn't never challenge in reality the ownership model, and that meant that the capitalist or the capitalist class or the economic elite, it's not important what to call it, they kind of maintained the coercive force, the coercive power, and when the 70s came and the inflation soared, oil crisis, etc., then they kind of hit back, and then in the last decades have been able to roll back a lot of the success. So I think the lesson from this experience is that when the left has power, we should not just redistribute by taxes, we should go to the kind of roots of the problem and redistribute ownership. And of course, there were important social democratic voices, radical thinkers, like the Swedish economist Rudolf Meidner, for example, who's really acknowledged this. He has this famous phrase saying that as long as the capitalists maintain the ownership, they will always have a gun pointed to the head of the workers' movement. It's a little bit brutal, but I understand the picture, if I may say. So I think that's the main kind of lesson from historical social democracy, that we need to challenge concentrated ownership to our production and digital assets, land, housing, etc. Piketty, in his latest books, actually focuses more and more on these issues also. Now you say that his books are really great, but or thick. But the last one, called A Short History of Inequality, is kind of a summing up of his book, and he focuses a lot on pre-distribution. And what I really like about this book is also this, and his thought is this about that all societies organizes ownership in different ways and always kind of justify this ownership. So, when we had feudal society, it was kind of seen as a natural way of organizing, the same for slave society. And actually that's the same now when we talk about, for example, when my book came out in Denmark, I was invited in the national radio in the morning, and this guy from a right-wing paper kind of attacked me. But you will take away the ownership of in the big companies from those who own the stocks today. And I said, yeah, but for me it's more radical how it is today, that people who go to work every day have less influence in the decision making where they deliver their work than some kind of stock owner on the other side of the planet who have never set his foot on this factory. So this idea that the organization of ownership is not natural law, it is political law, we're able to change it. That's I think, really important contribution from Thomas Piketty.
We are approaching the end of this discussion. A short question. Yeah, please. Yeah, thanks.
Hey, everyone. So my question is, in this capitalist socialist spectrum that we have in the economy, in the state, politicians or people in power are like the catalyst of change in one direction or in the other. But of course their power comes from the voters, at least like in a democratic country. The idea is that in the last few years we have seen this discussion move away to other values, important values. But I would like to ask how we can make fashionable again the discussion about socialism.
Actually, my impression is that it is quite fashionable, not least among younger people. There was this poll in the United States just a few years ago showing that the majority of people below 30 or 35 years, I don't remember exactly, when they were asked if they were more favorable to socialism than to capitalism, a big majority actually pointed to socialism. I think that, of course, our challenge about socialism is that the right wing will always try to point to this so-called socialist experiments in China or Soviet Union, and that's why I think it is so important to point to that in the Nordics, at least, there have always been kind of several currents of socialist ideas, and the welfare society is based on socialist ideas. So I think when people ask you, but where have socialism ever functioned? Then you should say, right here in our public libraries, in our hospitals, in our universities, in our schools, in our daycare centers, in our cooperatives. And we want to build from that experience, and we want to deepen and expand them. I think if we frame that in this way, I think a lot of people would agree and would love to take part in this project. And of course, that's the most important, because all these kind of reforms, of course, they can come. Some of them will have to go through parliament or municipalities or what it is. But if there's no demand from below, for example, we should not democratize working places if the workers don't want to have more democratic influence in the working place. But my impression is that a lot of people are feeling disempowered and want to be empowered, not only in the working place, but also, for example, having the power to take the decision to de-invest in fossil fuels. Today we cannot do that because we do not have the power. It's banks and financial institutions that have that kind of power. So I think we should, for me it's not so important if we call it socialism. I like the words because it's a very precise way of understanding the idea of expanding democracy from the political sphere into the economic sphere and as far as possible into our working life sphere. For me, socialism actually just means, if it should be boiled in, it's just kind of taking away the power of a small minority over the great majority.
I know that we are running out of time, but I still want to ask you this last question, because we are running time also in terms of climate change. So I think it's very difficult to discuss about the future of the Nordic societies without grasping this issue at all. So as we know, that climate change is not only about extreme weather, but it's also about what the extreme weather does to our societies. And we know that there is going to be drastic increase in migration and social conflicts, and taking the fact that Nordic countries have recently adopted highly conservative and inhumane policies in terms of border control and refugee politics. This is a very complicated issue of what climate change does, and I know it's a bit unfair to ask this as the last final question, but still I couldn't resist not asking. I would really want to hear more of your thoughts about this issue. How does climate change affect on the societal level on our possibilities to maintain, develop and rebuild the Nordic welfare society?
Well, I think in several ways, but when I wrote the book, I asked myself, is this really a book for our times? Because, of course, climate change is not kind of the starting point from the book. It's about democratizing the economy, mostly. But I think even though that these two things are linked very much together, as I said before, it's about who takes the decisions. So, for example, we know that we should change investment, billions and billions of investment away from fossil fuel to circular, sustainable investments. And to be able to take that kind of decision, we need more democratization. So just to be concrete, for example, expanding the public investment banks. I don't know much about the Finnish investment bank, but at least in Denmark we have this kind of public investment banks that invest in green transition. But it's all too small because but it has to be market conform and all this kind of discussion. But we can take steps to mobilize public money for doing what the private capitalists won't do. So I think the idea of empowering us by democratizing investment and all this kind of stuff is central. But of course, one social democrat in Denmark who liked the book, a former minister, he said, I agree in a lot of the things that Pelle is saying, but the problem is we do not have time right now for this confrontation with capital. So right now, forget about it. We will have to use the next 10 years to cooperate with capital in order to solve the climate crisis, and then we can discuss ownership. And I get his point in some way, but actually I think that we could do this both at the same time. And I think we should do both at the same time. And then I think it's important to stress that we talk a lot about, the negative consequences of this green transition, how it will be a burden on workers and so on. But actually it is also a possibility, because when you make this big changes in your production infrastructure, and this is the biggest changes that we have done in Europe since World War II, just in material changes of how production is organized. It is a possibility to use it to reorganize also ideas of ownership and so on. So, for example, it is no coincidence that the welfare state was created when we rebuilt Europe after World War II. So I think it's so important that we should use that green transition to, for example, a new energy production should be owned democratically as far as possible. I've just made an agreement in the Danish parliament where we secured a 20% state ownership of new windmill parks at sea. Of course, 20% is all too little, but still it was a clear breakaway from neoliberal ideas of how to organize this. So I think we should use it. And of course, then concerning how the world will change, I think the issue of migration already today is something that is a big obstacle for left-wing parties, because it kind of splits the people and the groups in society who should together organize for change. And I would love to talk about it for a long time, but I think the important thing is to remember that when we talk about migration or talk about green transition or climate, we should never forget the class structure of also these discussions. And I think maybe the left in some way has, on both discussions, not been good enough at doing class politics while fighting against racist migration politics, or doing class politics was fighting against climate policies. But it would take too long to elaborate more on it. I would love to come back sometime to take that discussion also.
I assure you would be very welcome if you want to come back and continue with the discussion. But now let's give a warm thanks to Pelle.